Thank you for the introduction. I don't want to start, well, first thank you for having me as a keynote. I wasn't supposed to be the keynote, but I'm happy to fill in for Marcus. I'm not a big American, I don't have a mustache, and he's probably more interesting than me. That's funny actually, I was supposed to have a mustache, but my wife vetoed it. My first slide is maybe a little depressing, but I think in recent years, a lot of our peers have passed away. And normally I would do a slide only on Barnaby Jack because he was a colleague of mine. But I thought, especially because there was recent deaths from Cedric and Peter as well, I thought it was a good time to remember that we always stand on the shoulder of giants. And there's people that we have to be reminded of that they contributed a lot to our community. So this is a slide that I definitely wanted to start off with. I heard from the organizers that they also wanted to remember some people, and I probably forgot some people that you think about. Let me improvise this. I suggest that there's a flip chart there. If there's somebody that you remember or something that you want to put on paper, just take the in between talks or during breaks, write down whatever you want, and then we can keep that and the organizers can do something with that. How does that sound like an idea? Okay. So this is an important slide for me. I'm on the board of directors of IC Square. Are there any CISSPs in this room? Have you voted already? Have you put in your vote for the elections? Okay, awesome. If you haven't already, go to the website, log in, and put in your vote, because it's important for me to have good colleagues to work with next year, and it's you that decide who that will be. So thank you for that. And then we dig into the meat of the presentation. The presentation came about in a very funny way. I was having beers with somebody that was in security in the past here in Vienna, but she decided to stop in security, and she's now working as a diplomat. And we were talking about China and APT, and especially the report by Mandiant earlier this year that was really focused and America-centric. It had a very America-centric vision. And I happen to know a thing or two about China. I studied some Chinese culture when I was in university, and I'm also married to a Chinese wife, which is not always representative for the whole Chinese population, but I have a small sample bias in this presentation maybe. But I think it's important to look at China from a Chinese way, to understand their culture and some cultural concepts that could help defenders to understand the threats and to also address it better. So I'm Wim Remmes. I'm not really important. I'm a managing consultant at IOActive, director at IC Square, and organizer of the Broekon conference in Belgium. The first thing I want to show you, and I hope this works well, is a video.
International friends. No. Yes, I am.
I'm Blair.
Blair?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Georgie.
Hey, this is my roommate. Her name is Apple. She's really cool, except she just bought a really ugly Vampire Diaries poster.
Well, I guess I feel like international students group together. Some of them do form bonds with each other.
Coming from the same place, it's probably easier to find the same interests and become friends with those.
Feels like they understand like cultural cues, or they also just speak the same language.
But actually, we do want to know people outside. Yeah. Sometimes, I need to go like, maybe we are shy, or they are shy, so we're not talking to each other.
And you have to be very bold. You have to like show what kind of person you are to them, instead of being asked by them or like waiting to be taken into the conversation with them.
平时交朋友是不是这种方式？所以反而会觉得挺累的。就是你要总会
大学生都很酷嘛，你要是学会美国那个酷的方式，才能真正跟他们相处好。
So it's not just like an environment where you can just sit and then like act naturally. So I always have to try.
I'm Blair. I'm a freshman as well. I don't know what I'm going to concentrate on.
You have to really understand their pop culture, and then you have to watch TV shows that they usually watch. So there's definitely some jokes, and I had no idea about. But it's fine. I can tell jokes that they don't understand.
So he's talking about like he jokes every day or something in Chinese, which I don't. It's never.
我特别想认识法国人。啊，你要吗？我介绍给你。好啊，要不然我法语是真的。我觉得他长得特别像哈利波特。
So I hope you all hear that well. Maybe not. Okay. So this is a stupid video that I came across, not even while doing research for this talk, but it's a video about Chinese overseas students that go to an American college and try to integrate. And I think it showed really well the difference between how the US looks at the world and how China understands the US. So I took some quotes from the video, and the Americans were saying, I have no close international friends, international students group together. And then coming from the same place, it's probably easier to find the same interests. They understand the cultural cues, they use the same language, so maybe it's better that they group together. Uncle Sam says this. So if we correlate this to the Mandiant report, it's really US focused. They don't do any effort on understanding the culture. On the other side, if you look at the Chinese people, they really try to understand the culture. And I think with this presentation, that's what we also need to do. I can tell jokes that nobody understands very well as well, but I'm going to try not to do that today. With these quotes, what I derive from that is that they really understand the culture they are working with. And unfortunately, a lot of security information that we see right now is really biased. It's seen from an American point of view. Where we are going to, what I'm going to try to do is compare cultures, where you have very rich Chinese culture. You have a limited US culture, and this is a funny slide. It's not meant to be an offensive slide. I'm better at showing jokes than at telling jokes. If you look at Chinese history, it's really impressive. You talk about almost 4,000 years. If you talk about US history, and I know that the US wants to focus their history also on American prehistory, but I'm looking at history that has defined the culture as the countries are now. And then you really talk about the moment that Columbus came into the US, and China just has a much richer culture. What you also see in China, and that was especially in the dynasties, it had a cycle. It means that the dynasties changed. There was new leadership, but the ideas and the how should I say that? The ideas and the beliefs remained the same, and the way the society was structured remained the same within China as well. The most important part in this whole cycle is the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven means that the people believe that the leadership has the approval from the skies that they are allowed to lead. And the moment that they lose it, that's when everything starts to dwindle down, and new leadership comes up, gets the mandate of heaven again, until they have lost the mandate of heaven. that was suggested by somebody. I didn't find that on my own, unfortunately. Now, if you look at America, there is a sentence that every American has said at least once in their life. I'm not going to say it because I'm not American. But one nation under God, I relate that to the mandate of heaven. I mean, if God approves of America, then everything is good. And if you look at that cycle in Chinese history, in the beginning it was like 700 years for every dynasty, and then it went down to 200, 100 years, so you have a cycle. And I believe if you look at the larger geopolitical field, then I believe at this moment that the US is losing the mandate of heaven and is struggling to keep that, their strong position, both on a political level and on the economical level. Now, delving into APT, what you cannot expect from me in this talk, and I think that's a good thing, I'm not going to try to really define APT, and I'm not going to use any Art of War quotes. I went through the APT report again, and I wasn't really happy when I read it the first time. I wasn't really happy when I had to read it again for this talk. But I took a little different approach. I started to look for words that reference to how they related that to the Chinese people and the Chinese society. And if you look for culture in the report, there's 2 references, and they're all part of the word agriculture. And tradition is used as well, but it's always part of the word traditional when they talk about traditional Chinese characters. So there's really no reference whatsoever. Going back to the dynastic cycle, because I think that's where the core of the Chinese society, even as it exists now, is what was built. Quickly going through the cycle, so the leadership obtains the mandate of heaven, they grow weaker over time, some disasters struck, and the people believe that the dynasty has lost God's approval, it's overthrown, there's a new leadership, and we go back into a cycle. What I'm going to do now in the presentation is go through some very deep Chinese beliefs. The first one that I wanted to touch upon is Nei versus Wai. Those are 2 characters that are really important in Chinese culture, and they mean Nei means inside, and Wai means outside. And here you have the family, but even within the family, there is Nei and Wai implemented. Which means Nei is everything that happens in the house, and where within Chinese culture, the wife is responsible. And I'm not going to discuss on the sexist elements of that, but it's really strict there. The wife takes care of the internal part, and the man takes care of the external part. Then Nei also is your family towards the community, but you are also Nei within your community. And then the rest of everything outside your community is Wai. You as a country are Nei. Everything outside your country, China is a very big country, so everything outside China are barbarians. That was like that in the dynasties, and they really still believe. The word for foreigner is La Wai, is old outsider. So it's still ingrained in the culture. We've seen that over the years. China has what they call a tributary system. They never really built until very recently, and then I talk about 100 years ago. They didn't have a minister for foreign relationships because they didn't think it was necessary. Everything was about China. They had approval from heavens, and other countries could get benefits from doing business with China by paying tribute to the emperor, and that's how they worked. If you look at Chinese history, they never conquered or they never did any colonization across the world. They didn't have a navy, so they never had big set of boats that they took out to go to war with other countries and conquer other land. They did have boats to do expeditions to make sure that people far away could pay tribute to them, which is a very smart thing to do, I think. And the second element that I want to talk about is a very interesting thing called guanxi. Is anybody doing business with China or has relationships with Chinese companies? Or are you familiar with this concept? If you look at for me the left, for you the right part of the slide, this is how Western societies are built. There is a hierarchy of people. In China, there is not really a hierarchy of people. There is guanxi, which means relationships. Everybody has that sounds really bad. Everybody has relationships with everybody else, but not in that kind of way. And basically, the number of relationships and where you are positioned in this grid defines your hierarchy. And your guanxi is very important. You have to protect your connections. So it's based on your reputation, on how well you treat your connections. And the more connections you have, the more people you can connect to other people, and the more important you get within within society. So obviously there are also hierarchical relationships. The simple one being ruler versus subject, which is the leadership of a country, of a company, of anything, to whoever is beneath there. Then parent versus child, and I'm going to dig into that a little further in a few minutes. And then older sibling versus younger sibling, husband versus wife, and older friend versus younger friend. Those are the 5 main relationships that are defined within Chinese culture. And then there is one more relationship, which is equal to the parent versus child relationship. And that's a relationship between a student and their teacher. There is basically, outside your parents, there's nobody more important than your teacher. If you look at it from a APT point of view, the people that you learn from and that you work with, that teach you how to hack into American servers, so to say, is someone that you have to respect for the rest of your life. The last concept, and this is something that goes really far. Everybody knows the phrase lose face, right? In China, it's really important. And I can illustrate that with a personal story. When I first met my then girlfriend, now wife, and I don't know how she held up with me for so long. So we're married 11 years this year. When her father found out, so her father is also Chinese, that happens when you have a Chinese girlfriend, the father happens to be Chinese, he basically told her, you have to leave the house or you drop your boyfriend. She luckily chose to leave the house. I think mostly because it was an appropriate time for her to move on and start living on her own. It was not for me. But I tried to understand why he did that. And he basically did that because within his group of friends, he would lose face if his Chinese daughter would be connected to a Belgian white guy. And it took him 4 years to get to grips to that. And when he saw that some of his peers, his brother, for instance, their daughter also was dating a Belgian guy, and they were okay with it, he became okay with it as well. Funny thing is that there are 3 words for face, and they all 3 mean different things. But the main thing to remember is that somebody that's Chinese, you always, if you want to maintain a relationship with that person, you always have to make sure that you don't make him lose face. The moment that you have someone and you make him lose face, then you're going to have to do a lot of work to bring that relationship again. And now, when we looked at after we looked at those different concepts, it's not my job to define APT. I want to look at APT from a cultural perspective. So, from a cultural perspective, I believe that Chinese attackers that are organized believe that they are mandated to do this. For them, it's okay to do this. Obviously, for the people that are attacked, that's not. But that's not what matters for us. From a cultural perspective, they believe they are mandated to do this. Knowing how they build relationships, we also learn that we work with a very closely knit group of people. It's not one person, it's multiple persons, they work together and they have very strong relationships. They are binded, and from their perspective, the people that they are attacking are barbarians, and they don't really matter. Everything is about China, everything is about our goal, and everything outside of their belief structure doesn't matter. What I think is most important to remember, especially if you remember the video that I showed you, they understand us probably better than we understand ourselves. So they actually do work to understand our culture much more than we do to understand their culture. They cannot lose face. I mean, the way the Mandiant report was brought out was really offensive towards Chinese people. Obviously, Mandiant doesn't have any interest to go and do business in China, but from a political point of view, probably the US government had to do a lot of damage control there. And it's much harder to work with the Chinese once you make them lose face. That's important for you as a defender to know as well. If you have somebody attacking your infrastructure, he's part of a larger societal structure. The attacker that you're working with or working against, if you try to make him lose face, you impact their structure directly. You have to try to understand the position of the actor that you're working with as well. They have a hierarchy where you have scanners, people that actually do exploitation, people that do exfiltration. You have to try and understand the position of the person that is currently on your infrastructure. If you understand that, you can also understand better how to work with it, with a specific attacker. Do you want to work to wait until somebody with a higher position comes in and tries to do exfiltration, or do you want to nix him immediately? Trying to understand their position is very important as well. And then you have to understand that it's never one person that you're dealing with, it's always a large team. So work to understand their structure, understand how they are built, how they are working together. And those are basically the main guidelines I want to give with this presentation. And I think I'm a little, well, I have some time left. If anybody has some questions about specific parts of this presentation or Chinese culture or experience that you have, feel free to ask. Is there another microphone, or I will come to you.
Very interesting talk. A question is, if Chinese company have a branch somewhere nearby you and you're working with that branch, are you a barbarian? Is this branch a barbarian branch? Where is Nei and Wei?
That's a very good question. So the question is, if you're you have a Chinese company close to you, are there Wei or are they Nei? The concept that I talked about earlier. As far as I would understand it, they are still Nei within their own company, but they could be by some departments, if it's a specific department of that branch, they could be considered Wei. So within a company you would have Nei is the whole company, but then different departments also have their concept of Nei and Wei. And you, even though you are close to that company and doing business with them, you always remain Wei.
So it's kind of interesting to see the difference in culture. How can people really start to learn more about the differences in culture and start to work better with people in China instead of constantly working against them?
I don't think it's China alone. I learned a lot about understanding and trying to understand other cultures by traveling. That's the first thing you need to do, expose yourself to other culture. One of the main books I used to research this topic was, funnily, a book written by Henry Kissinger, who has done a lot for Chinese-American relationships. He has written a book on China, which is titled On China. That was supposed to be a joke. Haha, okay. And that book, it's a very big book, or a large book, but it's very interesting to read. He goes through all the dynasties, how they expose themselves to the outside world, and then especially the turning point where, I don't know if anybody knows a little bit about Chinese history, but there was a moment where the British were basically just fed up with the Chinese, and while they wanted to maintain that relationship, they also came out with their navy and they completely trashed them at their ports to force them to start working with outside countries to do actual business. And that's also the moment where they where the Chinese implemented their foreign relationships ministry for the first time. So I think reading some books about China in particular, but exposing yourself to other cultures all the time is really valuable, not only for your security job, but for yourself as a person as well.
I have lots of questions, sorry. So do you think that the Mandian APT-1 report has done irrevocable damage? Or do you think it's just another one of those situations where it was a flash in the pan, wonderful for Mandian as a marketing tool, but it just doesn't matter in the long term? Or do you think we need to try and revisit some of the accusations and maybe try and make things a little bit better?
Again, that's a very good question, and I didn't expect very good questions from you. I wouldn't say that on a political level it has done irrevocable damage. And as far as I'm concerned, it really was a marketing effort. I mean, it was 1 week before RSA this year that they published it. It doesn't have a lot of conclusive data. There's a lot of assumptions in it. And it would be interesting if they actually release their data set and other people could take a look at it, both from a technical point of view and from a cultural point of view, to come up with a more unbiased report. But I doubt that's going to happen. There's one here.
Thanks. You had multiple times the phrase, we are barbarians. Is that a phrase seen to generally everyone outside of China, or is it a phrase pointed towards Western cultures?
We are? Oh, yeah. No, that's actually a concept that is actually part of the Chinese culture. Everything outside China is barbaric. We don't need to, and by barbaric they actually mean we don't need to do an effort to understand them because they don't matter. They're outside China. They don't have the approval from the heavens, and they just don't matter. And those are the barbarians, and that's a concept that's not something I came up with. That's really if you read Chinese history literature, it's a concept that's really ingrained in Chinese history. I'll be right back. There was one before you.
How much of this cultural thing is generic Asian, and how much of this is just China?
I get very good questions today. I love you. So if you look at, this is very specific Chinese. If you look at Japan, for instance, they have very similar concepts, but they are completely separate from China, and there was even a lot of conflict between both. If you look at other Asian countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, even the Philippines, they have completely other concepts and they are more open to Western culture. This is really very specific Chinese.
Yeah, going back to the idea of that we're all barbarians, I guess, doesn't that contradict a little with what we saw in the video, where it really showed that the Chinese people were trying to understand the Western culture and were making a very big effort? So it wasn't that it didn't matter to them; they really wanted to know. And also, I guess, and another question: your timeline stopped at, I guess, the Boxer Rebellion. What has changed since then?
Those two questions are actually interrelated. After the Boxer Rebellion and when the Communist Party came to be, they understood that there were some things there they were missing. And in the earlier 1900s, they sent out some of their smarter people, especially to French universities, but also to US universities. And it was not to reach out to other people, but just to acquire what they were missing. What you see in economically right now, and I watched some documentaries on that, there is a thing they call block and paste, where there is a new technology, like for instance Twitter comes out. They don't adopt Twitter. They look at how Twitter works, they implement their own version, and they block Twitter at the Chinese firewall. So they have Weibo. We have Twitter. And in that sense, they want to learn from the outside world, but they don't want to involve the outside world. And that concept still, in their economic ventures, you still see that happen very much. So if you've, one more.
Yeah, do you think that that concept you described just right now could change in a few generations? So do you think that maybe the old Chinese people are, I don't know, are living this concept and then the younger generation is more, they want to interconnect with other people, with maybe the West or whoever?
Again, a very good question, and I think we in the next 20 to 50 years we will see that change indeed. That change is already very apparent in the southern region of China, in Shenzhen and Hong Kong. Hong Kong is something different, but in Shenzhen you see a lot of young American or American Chinese coming back to China because there is a culture or motivation for economic innovation. So they bring everything that they learned there, and also the culture that they've acquired overseas back to China. So you see that there's young entrepreneurs that are battling against the communist system and trying to inflict change in that way. So I think within a certain amount of time, we will definitely see that change.
So how could you tell anything about how they deal with privacy information? I heard a lot of stories that, for example, companies try to establish there, and they say, okay, you have to do business with us, you have to put a factory here, and after that they can start replicating their products. And so it seems that they are very aggressive in that way. So anything you can tell about that?
So I didn't do a lot of research about that topic for this presentation, but it comes back to that concept that I called block and paste, where they will allow you to come and build your factory to start producing, and then they will make it extremely difficult for you to actually, for instance, export the stuff that you produced. So in the end, you will have to go out of business, but they have acquired everything that you have done, and they know how to do it better than you. So those are things that you definitely see happening on an economic scale.
We have heard a lot about China, but there is also the other thing. Do you think that we should also focus on this problem with other cultures? I mean, we have in the security area, we have lots of threats from different countries which do have different cultures. I mean, it might not be that extreme with the Chinese, but still, there are differences.
I would agree with you, but especially for China, because their culture is built over so many years and really ingrained into the core of the country and the people, it's a little bit different. Especially if you, for instance, look at Eastern Europe, the drivers for hacking and for hacking into companies and steal assets is more economic than it is cultural. But I think it always helps to understand other cultures and to work from that concept more than just from a we good guys, they bad guys concept. Any more questions? Okay, then I would like to close it down here. Oh, one more, sorry. I get a lot of exercise here.
You talked a lot about the motivations and culture of the Chinese. You talked very little about what should we change in our relationship to China. Should we stop dealing with them? Should we advise our companies here in Europe to open branch offices in China? Should we tell them to stop outsourcing to China? What's your concrete steps we should advise our companies here in Europe to do?
Okay, I'm going to address it with the simple phrase that it's not a threat, it's an opportunity to start with. I think, especially in the past few months, we've learned that the threat doesn't only come from China, it also comes from the US, and all our data belongs to them. So why should we focus on China as an adversary if even the strongest power in the world is an adversary to everybody else in the world? I wouldn't focus on China, but I would try to, if they belong in your threat model, and that doesn't, that's not the case for everybody, then just try to understand them better. But I don't think there needs to be a focus on China as a particular threat when the US and even the UK is a specific threat for individuals within the world. More questions? Going once? Going twice? I'm done. So thank you for your attention. If there are more questions.